let's jump right in talking about the future, the present, and how to make sense of it all in ordinary, or shall we say, extraordinary time. And taking us through this will be a longtime friend of Anselm. Matthew Clark is a singer-songwriter, writes, well, you always introduce yourself as a singer-songwriter, but you can also just say writer at this point. He's published a wonderful collection of essays that he's edited together into a book with just gorgeous little reflections on them. Only the Lover Sings, well worth your attention. And yeah, another one of my favorite people in the world who we're just absolutely blessed to have with us this fall. Matthew Clark, ladies and gentlemen.
Thank you, brother. Hey, everybody. It's good to be here again. I do love this place. I'm really excited to be with you today. And Anselm is a place that I especially love. I'm thankful for the way they're also practicing intellectual hospitality. Have y'all heard this term from Diana Glyer? There are faithful followers of Jesus Christ from a lot of different traditions and backgrounds here today in this room, and that is a treasure for us. So as we talk about time today, maybe something will sound strange or challenging this weekend. I love you, okay? And I pray the Lord will take those things and turn them into fruitful, hospitable conversations in our midst, that the one Spirit that we all share would craft something unimaginably good as we turn our faces towards Jesus, trusting Him together, especially in those places where we wonder or where we worry. So I'm going to try to cover a lot of ground as we talk about time today and hope. So hang with me. You hanging? Okay. Yes. Let's dive in. Okay. So we are creatures. You didn't make yourself. Did you know that? We are creatures within a creation, and whatever time is, we only ever experience it from within this creaturely context. So to us, time is always bound up in creation. But what I want to emphasize today is that time is not merely a property of physics or even a sort of neutral dimension of creation. But more primarily, what I want to say today is that time is a sort of property of personhood, of relationality. I want to look at time as the relational room that God opens to us where love may grow. Time as the relational room God opens to us where love may grow. Now, how does love grow? Well, it grows as we rightly respond to the presence of some other person in our midst. In other words, as we make and keep promises to care for someone in a trustworthy way. God has given His creation this beautiful gift of time in which to develop. I'm going to use the word develop a lot. He has set His creation within the medium of His loving promise. This world is gestating. The world and each one of us is a little promise that is unfolding within the medium of time. And that's what I want to talk about today. So, many years ago, I was hanging out with this mentor of mine, and I'd gone to visit him, and we were out somewhere in like a big bookstore like Barnes & Noble. And I remember there was this big picture book in the science section, and on the cover of the book it said, "What is time?" And I love my mentor's response. But first you have to understand this mentor of mine a little better. He's one of the most careful, considerate communicators I've ever known. He's also one of the wisest Bible teachers I've ever encountered. So when I read that book cover, "What is time?" he immediately responded, "Time is God's experience of Himself." And I was like, what? In fact, I was so what that I didn't even have, I didn't know how to even ask him to explain that, so he never did. So I'm still not entirely sure what to make of that, honestly. But it did get me thinking of time in more relational terms. So you've heard people talk about perichoresis, right? Are there any dancers in the room? Perichoresis is, we get the word choreography, and it's like the dance that's going on, the dance of love that's going on with the members of the Trinity. So that's one thing my mentor's definition made me think of, that there's this shared experience of love within the Trinity, and that we are being gradually worked into that. That beautiful dance that has always been going on among the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. So perhaps time is the means by which God is enfolding us into His experience of Himself. Mysterious, right? But it begins to make more sense as we think of time as this property of personhood, of relationality, rather than merely an impersonal force like gravity. Time is more like a quality that exists between or among persons. Robert Jensen describes time as God's way of, quote, making narrative room in His triune life for others than Himself. Time is a gift God gives to His creatures in order that they may become, quote, players and participants in a drama that takes place within the divine life. Pretty cool. Beautiful, beautiful. But is that what you've been taught? Yeah, surprised me neither. I thought time was either this neutral condition of creation, or worse, a trap to escape. But as Christians, we have a very different understanding of time than the rest of the world. John Oswalt is an Old Testament professor and a Bible translator, and he points out that for the ancient world, time was understood as a prison. God has put these time markers in creation, right? We've got moon phases and sun cycles, right? And for the ancient pagan cultures, time was a cycle. It was a cycle like the months and the years that repeated endlessly and unchangingly. You got the snake eating its tail, right? We're not getting anywhere. However, Oswalt says that the Hebrews broke from that cyclical way of understanding time as a trap. Unlike the surrounding cultures, the Hebrews saw time as a linear progression that was always developing, and it was always breaking out of that cyclical trap and opening into new and greater realities. That sounds like relationship, doesn't it? Time was always breaking out of the prison of merely natural cycles, precisely because of the personal involvement of a loving God who makes and who keeps promises. The world and time are not cycles that shackle us. They are a dynamic, developing dialogue between God and humanity. The world and time are themselves an invitation to loving union with God. But how in the world did the Hebrews get that view of God that was in time that was so different from everybody else around them? I'm just waiting. I'm hoping you know that answer. Let's look at the story of Abraham and Sarah. You remember this. Abraham and Sarah are promised a child, and then like a few days later, there's Isaac. All right? How long did it take? 25 years go by. 25 years? You can imagine it had to have felt like God had made an empty promise. For 25 years, nothing happens. Or does it? To a modern mind, it looks that way, but to a Hebrew mind, that 25-year period is itself the history of God developing that promise. Oswalt says that the Jews were the first to take history seriously, and Glenn talked about it this morning in his session, because they observed that God worked by way of time to develop his relational promises among his people in the world. Now, granted, during that 25 years, Abraham and Sarah did not feel like the promise was being faithfully developed, right? You ever experienced that? You're in the in-between time. We tend only to feel that kind of thing in hindsight. While we're in it, it feels like thirst and hunger. It feels like frustration. In a word, faith-keeping. But eventually the Hebrew people, they started to pick up on this pattern. This pattern of how God was working through time. And they got really serious about keeping track of God's mighty acts of faithfulness in their midst. They saw that time is a medium of relationship, and time is the medium in which promises are developed and realized. Making sense? So watch what happens next. What happens with the promise of Isaac? Well, the story goes on and it continues to develop. It develops until another promised son, like Isaac, is born in Bethlehem. Now that's a development that is unimaginable to Abraham. He could not have seen that coming. Instead of cycles of doom in a circular prison of time, the Hebrews bear witness to patterns of promise that develop and expand within the medium of time. And they call this history. Plato saw time and history as prisons to escape, but we are to understand history and time as a hospitable realm of promise and hope where God dwells with us, where God involves us in his life. Time is not our enemy. It is one of God's many gifts. It is given to us as a medium of promise, and love grows when promises are kept. Roger Lundeen was a teacher at Wheaton. He died a few years ago, but he points out that to the modern mind, time is not a source of hope at all. So much so that people may even long for death just to escape it. Those people see the Christian hope for a world without end as like the most miserable idea imaginable. And I have some friends that feel this way. He writes, if there is no story of transformation to be told, if there is no healing for the wound at the core of life, then why? Why would I endure endless time? But in contrast, we're beginning to see that time is the medium of God's solidarity with his suffering creatures. It's where he patiently works out his care for them. He allows them to develop without trespassing against the freedom that he's given them. Time is where God walks beside us, suffers on our behalf, and patiently allows us to develop in our full and fallen freedom. Death has made it appear that time is in short supply, but because of the cross and the resurrection, we know something better. Our times are in his hands, say the scriptures, not in death's grip any longer. So death is being converted from this brick wall that we expect to slam up against into this labor and delivery nurse who is going to hand us on to our eager, expectant Father. That doesn't mean we don't grieve it, that it's not an intruder, but it is being converted. If my wise friend is right and time is God's experience of himself, then by way of the gift of time, God is inviting us directly into participation in the divine life. I'm okay with that. So, we can see that time is not a prison. You're not trapped. Nor is it merely an impersonal force. Instead, it's this medium of personal development. So I'm using the medium. Are there any artists like painters or potters in here? Yes, I'm using the word medium like a painter or would say, paint is my medium, clay is my medium as a potter. Time is the medium of relationship. It's the medium out of which promises are shaped and realized. God's promises are kept not just in or through time, but by way of time. History is the record of God's relationship with His world. The Hebrew understanding we've looked at sees God as the primary actor in history. God is loving His world. He is constantly involved. He is always in the process of making, developing, and consummating promises by way of time. On the other hand, the modern mind does not think of time as a relational unfolding between God and His children. We think of time as a kind of deaf idol that can't hear our prayers, more like some kind of machine that's just bulldozing over everybody, or at best, it's just this like neutral thing, this neutral kind of condition of the universe, you know. There's a great book I've been reading lately. I just finished it. It took me like almost a year to read it. But there's a guy named Erazim Kohak, and he was a Czech philosopher. And he addresses this modern tendency. He says, we often mistake the constructs for the real thing. Clocks and calendars, those are human constructs. They're made by humans. But clocks are, to time, what musical notation is to music. Musical notation, I hope this is right. I'm watching musicians in the room. I don't read music, so like I'm looking at real musicians. So musical notation isn't itself the music. If somebody said, hey, let's just get rid of all live performance and just read sheet music quietly together. Right, that doesn't work. So these are constructs. Musical notation isn't itself music. It's this agreed upon construct that allows us to organize ourselves in order to perform a piece of music. And that's great. Clocks can give us an agreed upon construct that allows us to organize ourselves within time for certain tasks. So if I say, hey, let's meet at the coffee shop and hang out, and you say, oh yeah, what time? And I say, how about in the fullness of time? You might say, well, could you be like a little more specific? Right, that doesn't work either, but we do need the clock. We need the constructs, but we also need to remember that the clock isn't itself time. That's not actually what time is. The clocks and the sheet music aren't the things themselves. Music and time exist apart from sheet music, apart from clocks, as independent and mysterious realities. There will come a time when it will be my time to die. But that will have essentially nothing to do with clocks or calendars. I'm not saying, oh gosh, it's 3:47 p.m., time to die, right? No, I'm sensing that there's a metaphysical, relational quality about time. Phrases like, it's my time to die, give us these kind of clues about the meaning that we intuitively sense. We already sense this, and we build it into our language. I'll talk more about that and the idea of beautiful time a little later. But music is a good example of the Hebrew way of thinking about time, because just like it's impossible to summarize or compress a piece of music because it requires time to be what it is. And the same is true of promises. Promises require time to be what they are. So many things are like this. A baby is a promise that takes time to become an adult. A seed is a promise. This is just built into everything, right? Okay. I got to sidestep for a second, because we have to talk about Back to the Future. Hey, y'all, I forgot to look at y'all. I'm sorry. There you are. You're real people. You matter. Isn't it? Isn't it about time? Which segues perfectly into what I was trying to segue into, which is Back to the Future, because I know that's why you're really here, is to talk about Back to the Future. I get that. So I want to quickly clarify a notion about time that has captured our imaginations from sci-fi movies and stories. Lewis says art sneaks in the back door, and sometimes you don't realize what's taking up root there. So I'm not convinced this is biblical or real, but time travel. Time travel movies are super fun. Okay, I love them. But what they do is they provide an entertaining setting to explore two human conditions, at least two: regret and vulnerability. What would you go back and change if you could? And what would you go forward to learn that might mitigate risk? Interesting. Time travel stories, and more recently multiverse stories, reveal the human heart's longing to be healed from past hurts and to recover a sense of a beautiful, meaningful destination while mitigating vulnerability. Could my life have been different? Can it be different? In these stories, the past and the future are real places that if you just had the means, like a souped-up DeLorean, you could actually visit them. But I don't believe that time is a thing in the way that these stories depict. The past doesn't exist somewhere, and neither does the future. No one can go to either place because they don't actually exist as things. What does exist are memories and promises and their consequences. The past is present now through either remembrance or regret. But here's the good news. Jesus, through forgiveness, converts the regrettable past into a present remembrance of grace. The future is present now through either despair or through promise, hope. Here's the good news. God directs each of us by way of time into the development of His promises towards a future destination, a future hope. But the future hasn't happened yet, except in promise. Now, we humans make promises all the time that we can't keep. But if God promises it, it's as good as done, even if it hasn't happened yet. Hebrews says hope is an anchor for the soul. And Kate Bowler says God has dropped an anchor in the future. He is absolutely reliable. So why is it important? Why is that important? Why is it important whether or not the future has already happened? Because it means that it's not too late. It's not too late for any one of us to choose to respond differently to the voice of God in our lives. The future has not happened yet. It's not determined. You're not just going through the motions of some pre-decided, fixed reality. There is actually a name for that, and it's fate. Fate. Fatalism is a core feature of the pagan imagination that sometimes creeps into the Christian imagination, but it doesn't belong there. For example, this is a story a friend of mine told me, true story. There's this young man and he's working out at the gym. I don't know much about that, but people do it. He's working out at the gym and he sets a barbell on the counter. Barbells are round and heavy, right? And it rolls off and it lands on his foot. And he howls in pain, right? Of course he does. And then a few minutes later, when he's gathered himself together, he says, "Well, I sure am glad to have gotten that over with." Do you understand? He thought the future had already happened. Interesting. He believed the future already existed, that barbell was fated to fall on his foot. It didn't occur to him that in the kind of world God has made, wisdom is called for. In other words, do you think maybe he could have avoided having his foot crushed if he had just thought through how best to put away a barbell. Round things roll, heavy things are heavy, they fall, it hurt. Right? Was it fate? Maybe it was an issue of wisdom. It may be true that, and please hang on to your cabbages and tomatoes. It may be true that pagan fatalism has sometimes been baptized and renamed sovereignty. But sovereignty isn't about meticulous determinism. I would argue that in this world, even God doesn't always get what he wants. Clearly, there are evils in this world that God is not instigating. Not everything that happens is God's will. Because he has granted his creation otherness or separateness from himself, room is left even under his watch for deviations from his will. Timothy says, God our Savior wants all people to be saved and to come to a knowledge of the truth. Peter says, God does not desire that anyone should perish, but that all should come to repentance, and yet many reject him. Sovereignty, on the other hand, is the answer to this question: who has the credentials to rule? Do you remember Revelations 5? There was the scroll, and I wept because there wasn't anybody worthy to open it. But then the Lamb showed up. He can do it. It's not just that he's capable, it's that he has the credentials. He has the right to do it. God has the credentials. Only God has the credentials. He is the rightful sovereign over that which he has made, and in the end, he will be the righteous judge with regard to those deviations. That means your life is actually happening. It's real. You're in a real developing relationship with God. Now, what God has determined is the nature of the destination that he had in mind for humanity before the creation of the world. But the lived experience of pilgrimage en route to that destination, far from being predetermined, is a dynamic dialogue between a wise, loving God and his children as they grow in wisdom. That dialogue is marked by faithful God's promise-making and promise-keeping by way of time. Y'all hanging in there? Incidentally, this is what Romans 8:28 through 30 is about. God, the all-wise, can and will incorporate the good, the bad, and the ugly of our lives into his creative process of promise-keeping, to be with and like Jesus. To be with and like Jesus has always been the dream of God for humanity. That is the predestination. We are free to deviate from that destination, but a few verses after that, Paul says, anyone who calls on the name of the Lord shall be saved. Anyone who calls out to Jesus can be put back on track to the original predestination and the destination God had in mind for humanity when he created them. This is about God's desire and his ability to save us. If we will trust him, no matter what derailments plague us, he can and he will get us home to himself. I appreciate y'all's patience. Can I tell you a personal story of how this kind of came to life for me? Can I tell y'all too? Okay, good. You don't want to? Never mind. So nearly 15 years ago, my dad asked me and my brother Sam to help him plant some trees, to come down to the family farm, and he had bought 200 or 300 little oak saplings. And we'd be setting them in the ground over a couple of days, and Sam, my brother, the good son he is, he said, "Sure, Dad, I'll be there." And I said, "Nah, can't make it." But the truth was I didn't want to go. And the reason was because up to that time, I was carrying some resentment towards my dad. I mean, it's like typical stuff, right? Mostly to do with my own unreasonable expectations and immaturity, but it was enough. It was enough to allow bitterness to take root in my heart. So tree planting day comes, and I woke up that morning with no intention of going, but then I felt this burden of guilt. Something was wrong, and I felt it. I felt it enough that I changed my mind. I got in my car. I drove a few hours down to the farm. I got there late, but there was plenty of work. And Dad seemed glad that I was there. So he showed me, how deep to dig with the post hole diggers. You ever used a post hole digger? Yeah, Dad's like, yeah, we got some good equipment that'll help us dig. And he's like, here's your post hole digger. And I'm like, oh, I thought you meant like something more helpful. But he showed me, how deep to dig, how to set the sapling in there, how to pack the dirt around it. We worked all that day and the next day. But there was this one particular moment late in the afternoon, one of those days that I want to tell you about. I had walked to the far side of the field, maybe 100 yards away, and I looked back to where my dad was standing among these little saplings. They were about 2.5 feet tall, something like that. And the sun was kind of soaking everything in that honeyed golden light. I'm sure you've seen that before. And just then, the past and the future kind of struck me together. The past with all the regret that I was carrying about how my relationship with my dad had been up to that point. And then in those little saplings, I saw the future. I saw one day these are going to be grown and my dad is going to be gone. And in that moment, the Lord gave me a choice. I could keep moving in this direction, and I could wind up with a load of regret and bitterness, or I could repent. I could repent of the past. I could trust the Lord for the future. I could start to love my dad a little better than I had. And I could trust that a kind of relationship that I couldn't even see could develop. Well, it's been slow. It's been slow, but things are very different now. I can put my finger on a certain day in a certain field where the Lord gave me a choice about what to do with the time that had been given to me. It was not too late to respond to the invitation that God was offering. The destination of my relationship with my dad changed. It changed that day. And maybe you can think of something in your own life like that. So I've mentioned wisdom. Can we look a second at how promises are tied to wisdom? What do I mean? So you remember Genesis, right? In the Bible. It's kind of like towards the left. In Genesis, each thing reproduces in keeping with its kind. Okay, that means we live in a world that has a rationale to it. If you plant this kind of seed, you get this kind of plant. Sometimes, every time, right? You will reap what you sow. But how do you know what to sow? Well, it depends. It depends on what you want. But you have to be wise. Well, how do you get wise? Well, you get to know the world's maker, and you pay close attention to how he does things and how the things that he's made work. Now, we live in a broken world, so things don't always work like they're supposed to work. We're very familiar with that. But this world was made through and is sustained by the Logos. So it has this discernible logic to it. It's not chaos. It's an ordered cosmos. And God is always fighting back the chaos, right? Wisdom is the practice of gathering good information about how things work so you can make good decisions, like how to put a barbell on a counter. But also so you can keep promises. If I promise you an apple orchard, because of the kind of the world that God has made, I could plot a way forward. to that destination. I know this works. You know why I know this works? Because I've been eating a lot of apple butter and apple pie at Terry and Steve Moon's house because they have an apple tree in their backyard that is going, I wanted to say it's going bananas. It's going, I'm going to mix my metaphor. Is it a metaphor? But as humans, we're doing this kind of thing all the time. We're trying to see how things work so we can make wise decisions. So you can imagine then that God, on this much grander scale, is all wise. He is moving everything that He's made and all the promises He's made towards this consummation in the fullness of time. Fullness of time. It's my favorite time to meet people at coffee shops. So, personally, this gives me a lot of comfort. Why? Because it means that God has accounted for long, slow processes. Long, slow relational processes. He has made a world fit for persons, and time is part of what makes it so fitting for us. Growing people, guess what? Growing people takes a minute. It takes a little bit of time. And this was God's idea in the first place. This master artist is using the medium of time to grow us into His likeness. Here's the thing, as long as we're not disengaging from that process, we don't have to be more impatient with ourselves than He is. As long as you're not checking out, numbing out, or whatever, you can be patient. Sometimes I feel so frustrated with myself because I feel like I'm getting nowhere. I feel like I'm making such little progress. I feel just as insecure and envious and unloving. But then I remember two things. One thing is that I'm probably unable to see the full truth of God's work so far in my life. I probably am growing more than I feel like I am. And the second thing is, this is a long pilgrimage. I walked a Canterbury pilgrimage this summer. It was long. It was 85 miles. Boy, my feet were killing me. But this is a long pilgrimage we're on with the Lord. Change with machines is fast. You can flip a switch and the light bulb comes on. But change with people, even under normal circumstances, is really gradual, really slow. God's promise to conform us to the likeness of His Son, that's the destination, is a loving reality that if it ever really ends, it's not going to end anytime soon. Even arriving in the new time, I imagine, is not going to be like this finish in the way we typically think. If we're being united to Jesus, we're being united to one who is Himself unfinishable. You're never going to get finished with Jesus, where you're like, okay, Jesus, I know everything about you. What else can I do? There is always, as C.S. Lewis says, further up and further in to go. So thirsty. So I was asked to touch on this point. Pessimism and optimism. How many pessimists in this room? How many optimists? Sinners. Just kidding. So I think this is really interesting how both pessimism and optimism are perversions of Christian hope. They're both ways of refusing to acknowledge the fullness of reality, but their emphasis is reversed. Pessimism and optimism are ways of seeing what we want to see rather than what's actually in front of us. Pessimism refuses to see the good, and optimism refuses to see the bad. They are both dishonest. They're both dishonest ways of engaging reality and therefore unwise. In contrast, Christian hope takes in the full picture of all that is miserable and terribly wrong with the world, and all that is good, including all that God is doing to redeem. Here's some free advice. You ready? Do not invite the pessimist to your birthday party. He's a party pooper. He'll point out that being alive is absurd. Celebrating life is a farce. Candles, cakes, balloons. Pfft, how impractical. How can you justify this waste? Pessimists love to pop balloons. Here's some more free advice, since you asked. Don't invite the optimist to the funeral of your loved one. He will drive you nuts, trying to cheer you up when you're trying to grieve. Do you have a friend? Don't answer this out loud. Do you have a friend? Do you have a friend that you know to avoid when you're sad? Because they cannot stand the presence of grief. They're always telling you to keep on the sunny side, turn that frown upside down. They can't leave the room without saying, well, at least you still have one leg, or something like that. It's infuriating. Paul tells us to mourn with those who mourn and rejoice with those who rejoice, but the pessimist can't rejoice, and the optimist can't mourn. But the Christian can do both, because the Christian is invited to acknowledge and be honest about the whole of reality. And the whole of reality is full of both good and bad. There is much that is unbearably sad, horrific, straight up evil. But there's also so much beauty that miraculously endures somehow. And on top of that, at the cross, we've seen God Himself inhabit and bear the darkness that would otherwise have swallowed us up completely. The Christian can honestly rejoice and honestly mourn without having to pretend in either case. We do have hope, but the kind of hope we have frees us to be honest about our situation. There are people who thrive on negativity, who love to scratch the itch. There are people who cannot stand the smallest discomfort. One pretends like everything is wrong and the other as if nothing is wrong. But Christian hope calls us to stay on the road of reality and not fall into either one of those ditches. Hope is the prevailing theme, yes, because of who God is and what Christ has done. But the cross calls us to face the whole truth about both God's love and the world's desperate brokenness. At the cross, they are both fully present. So we can be fully present with people wherever we need to be, whether it's rejoicing or mourning. You guys doing okay? Okay. So if we take hold of this Hebrew way of thinking about time, then we begin to see the Scriptures as the history of this wise, promise-keeping God. Here's what the Bible is. It's the story of how a promise given to a man named Abraham was fulfilled through a man named Jesus Christ. It's not the story of everything God ever did. It's not all the information you would like to have, but it's the story of how God kept a particular promise. And that became very complicated, obviously. But this is the story of what's actually going on. And this is the story that saves the world. But did that fulfillment take time? Yes. Because time is the medium in which loving promises between real people are brought to fulfillment. Okay, but wait, now I'm beginning to see we need to add another element to this sequence, and that's trust or faith. Because promises over time call for trust, don't they? Faith, like time, is not an impersonal force. Trust is a living quality of relationship among persons. Because you are not me, you're free to reject me. And God has allowed us real separateness in this relationship so that union can be chosen and not coerced. That's important, I think. If this is the kind of reality that we are in, then trust is a part of being a person with another person. And trust involves vulnerability. Love requires risk. We have to trust the promise maker, wait for the promises as they become more and more true over time. No eye has seen, no ear has heard. By faith, we see the truthfulness of the promises develop and mature. We don't even know how true the promise really is until we've kept faith over time. But that is really scary. So isn't it helpful then, isn't it considerate that the Lord would direct His people to keep a record in the Scriptures of what? Of His faithfulness. Remember what we said about time travels. The antidote to the fear of the future is not invulnerability. It's trust. And we have a huge pile of stories testifying to God's trustworthiness. We are invited by those same Scriptures, by the way, to acknowledge our fears and our griefs, yes, and then to put our hope in God who cares for us, a God who always keeps His promises, who can get us home to Himself. But that doesn't make any sense to the modern mind, because it doesn't trust this trustworthy God. If God isn't trustworthy, then the best you can do is to take matters into your own hands. Abraham and Sarah did that before they learned how God worked. And the fear that comes from a lack of trust in God makes us impatient. We want instant gratification. We have short attention spans. Have you ever had this happen to you? Somebody zooms past you on the road, and 3 seconds later you end up at the same stoplight. That's impatience. Or maybe you just have like an awesome muscle car and it's just fun. Could just be fun. But if we reject the gifts of time and the call to trust, we are missing the invitation to be enfolded into the triune life. We're not going to see the wise patterns of God's loving promises developing by way of time. We're going to lose the thread of history itself, which is the record of God addressing that wound at the core of life and healing. If we're impatient, we'll hurry right past the glorious hope that we've been given, and time will be emptied of any meaning or promissory direction. There will be no joy set before us. It's no wonder then that for most folks, time is like this brute force. It's an impersonal, implacable, cruel machine that hears no prayers, doesn't care anything about your story, and just mows everything down to nothing. But we are seeing, I hope, that time is actually a way that God cares for us. So let me close with this. I'm a singer-songwriter, and since the beginning of September, I've been on tour because of COVID shutdowns. The last time I got to travel was 3 years ago. It's been a minute. I'm still kind of knocking the rust off, learning how to do it again. But it's been so good to be back on the road sharing songs and stories. And I told somebody just the other day, I said, man, it has been a beautiful time. And so I want to ask you, how can time be beautiful? It can be beautiful because time is not merely the sum of moments. It's more than that, isn't it? Or it can be. It seems to me that there's a quality that ingresses or enters into the moments and makes them more than they would be on their own. We could put it in terms of sacrament or sacramental ontology. We could say time is the sacrament of eternity. Time is taken and blessed and broken and given back to us as eternity. It becomes beautiful when it is taken up by the Trinity and made to be so much more than it otherwise could have been in and of itself. Erazim Kohak says, we shouldn't think of eternity as timelessness or even endless time, but as a term that refers to what the life of the Trinity is like. Eternity is the quality of the triune life. And God has ordained that time where we live should be the realm of the realization of eternity. God is always knocking on the door of time. And when he comes in, he brings eternity with him. Time is the place where eternity is to take up residence and be fully incarnated. Eternity is to be realized within and by way of time. Without this entrance of eternity into time, time remains moldering bread on an unblessed altar, unable to generate any substantial meaning, direction, or transcendent purpose for itself. But when God's image bearers, even y'all, when God's image bearers listen for and answer that knock at the door, the triune God enters in and makes of time a dwelling place for eternity. Time is meant to become beautiful as it is filled with the Trinity's own presence and life. Kohut goes on to say that this is in fact actually happening all the time. We sense it when we call the time beautiful or when we look back on a season and recognize God's presence and his care. The human calling is to be always opening our lives to the entrance of eternity into time. Each one of us becoming a crucial nexus point like the cross. To always be welcoming God as he has welcomed us. Time then becomes filled with a sense of destination, of expectation, and developing love. This is all going somewhere. That's what we begin to feel and sense more and more. All things are being called towards a singular face, the face of Jesus. That is the joy set before us. That is the beatific vision that every pilgrim strives towards. All things are being summoned to be reconciled in Christ. Reconciled means to be united again. And union with God and one another in God is what time is actually about. To be wedded to the Godhead, drawn up into the life of the everlasting Trinity. In other words, for eternity and time to become one thing. So that is our situation. That's what we're sitting down in, our situation. Union with God is what time is about. I like this phrase. God makes time for you. He makes time for us because he does. He has set eternity in our hearts. Love always bears eternity in itself. It is the living revelation of eternity, for God himself is love, says Sergius Bulgakov. He's made a world in which real people, whose lives are really happening, and real love can grow and develop. That is an act of hospitality. Henry Nouwen says, hospitality is when you make room in your story for someone else's story. And God is doing that, isn't he? He's sharing his experience of himself with us. He is making time for us and for our stories to become more and more true. And ultimately that our stories and his stories may become in time one. Thank you, guys.